My name is Shachar Elstein. I'm currently studying at City of London School for Boys down the road, and I'm chairman of our charity committee there. Tonight we'll be discussing questions such as, what are some of the biggest challenges that children face today? Why is the right to education so important, and what should that education look like, amongst others? I am honored to be joined tonight by Simon Wright and Chris Rose. Simon Wright is the Director of International Development, Policy, Advocacy and Campaign at Save the Children UK. He has worked in both health and development sectors since 1993, including the NHS and the UK Parliament as an advisor. He is responsible for Save the Children's UK global policy and advocacy activities. He will be speaking tonight about the Declaration on the Rights of the Child and the CRC, why Save the Children takes a child rights approach, and what it means in practice. Chris Rose, our second speaker tonight, is the director of Amos Trust, a small creative human rights organization. Amos has recently launched On Her Own Terms, a new campaign to transform the landscape for girls and young women on the streets. Chris was a founder of the Street Child World Cup in South Africa 2010, and prior to joining Amos, has 20 years of experience of working with marginalized children. He will tonight be speaking about rights from a grassroots level upwards and taking the example of children on the streets. He will also talk about the need for government intervention and why changing public perception and building local partnerships is so important. I'll now welcome Simon Wright to speak.
Thank you very much. It's very great of Just Share to invite us to come along and talk about this, and thank you for coming along as well. Hopefully we'll have a good discussion. I basically want to persuade you that child rights is a really vibrant, revolutionary approach that we need to put at the heart of all our discussions about the problems facing children in the world. Now, to do that, we have to think back about where child rights came from. And we know that if you look back in the history, in the UK, in Europe, in the developed world, then child rights did not exist in the past. Children were wholly seen as the possessions of their family. They did not have integral rights themselves as individuals. And you can see why in kind of pre-literate societies, farming communities, a child being able to work as soon as possible, the family being the unit of production, the family being the whole means of survival, then a child's contribution to that was needed urgently. And education was less important, technical skills were going to be less important in those eras. So a child was either an economic asset or potentially a liability, especially perhaps children with disabilities who would not have been seen as economically productive and wouldn't have been protected. And then we went into a period where in the Industrial Revolution, children went into mills and into factories and were working, and we all know, and I'm sure have heard, the kind of horror stories that you can see in the Industrial Revolution about the hours that children were working for very low pay. Children were quite useful, of course, to that era. They were small, they could get into smaller spaces, which is why we know about children kind of cleaning chimneys, but they were cheap and they were probably more replaceable as well. And that carried on, right up until 1900. In 1900, 1 in 6 children in the age of 5 to 10 age bracket was said to be in gainful employment. So it took a long time before the idea that children should not be working and that children had rights to be a child were developed. And you can track that back, that understanding of children as individuals with rights, to that period when it started to be recognized that children maybe needed protection, but at the same time, society that was going through the Industrial Revolution needed a more educated workforce, so education became more important. And you can see lots of the debates were about how much children should work and how much they should be in education. So as early as 1819, there started to be restrictions on the hours that children could work. But in 1819, that was a law that restricted their working hours to 12 working hours a day, so hardly fantastic. And in 1856, child labour was banned for under the age of 9, but over the age of 9, they could work up to 60 hours a week. So there were different kind of laws, different movements that started to talk about children needing the rights, needing to be protected, but not so much about their rights, to be protected and educated, but not their rights. Now, that situation still exists in many countries in the world. In many countries in the world, children remain an economic asset that belongs to their families and don't hold rights as an individual. And that's one of the things that Save the Children and other NGOs are involved in trying to change. We know that in 4 African nations in 2017, they did a study and found that over 50% of children aged 5 to 14 were working in Mali, Benin, Chad, and Guinea-Bissau. And currently, child labour makes up about 22% of the workforce in Asia and 32% of the workforce in Africa. Again, non-industrial societies, children will be working within family units, within householder farming in particular. So if you think about when child rights, a kind of big step for us anyway was Save the Children. We were founded in 1919 here in London, and founded particularly to try to campaign for the needs of children in Germany and Austria after the end of the First World War, when there was a blockade of food getting through and children were starving. And a woman called Eglantine Jebb founded Save the Children, first of all, as a kind of humanitarian relief organization, but also at the same time a campaigning organization. She was campaigning to lift this blockade. But by 1924, her thinking had developed enormously, and she'd formed the International Save the Children Union. And that union in 1924 produced what was called the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. And it took it to the League of Nations, which was the precursor of the United Nations, where it was adopted. And this set out kind of 6 rights of children. Children's right to develop, to be children, to be educated, to receive relief, to be known, to be basically supported to develop into full adults. And that was a very different set of concept around child rights. And after a number of iterations, that became the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted in 1989. And that sets out a set of basically articles which are guarantees to children around their rights, covering their right to survive, to learn, and to be protected. And it has key principles of non-discrimination, principles that the best interests of the child should be the central consideration when looking at public policy, and the inclusion of children in decisions that affect them, which is quite crucial. So since 1989, we're coming up to the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's been ratified in every single country in the world, with the exception of the United States of America, where in the US there are a range of objections to it that come from different forces, which has meant they've not actually ratified it, although of course they have protection laws in the US. There have also been optional protocols developed in addition to the UN, the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But, as we said, having those rights, having them ratified by governments accepting their responsibility, does not in itself change the situation. So we know that 150 million children worldwide are involved in child labour. 1 in 4 children, 20,000 marriages a day are of girls who are below the legal age for marriage within their country. So despite there being laws, that doesn't necessarily protect children. 732 million school-age children have no legal protection from corporal punishment. There's a growing movement in lots of countries to introduce that. But so when we look at these problems, I just really want to kind of summarize that we try to take a child rights approach, and it really is different to just thinking about needs and help. Child rights is a very different framework, and it's really important to us to use that framework to try and think differently about how you solve a problem. So it means that instead of thinking about children's needs and what people should do to help them, you think about their rights as individuals and the obligations that governments have undertaken to provide for them. So that sets out a very different way of thinking about the problems and the solutions than if you just think about needs. It also affects how we talk about children. Do we talk about them as passive recipients of help, or do we talk about them as actors who should be empowered to try and change their own circumstances? We need to involve them. We need to make sure they are consulted, that they have agency, that they can speak for themselves and are not just spoken for on behalf of others. And fundamentally we have an approach called child rights programming. And child rights programming has 3 pillars to it. The first one is basically where there are denials of children's rights, violations of children's rights, and we or other actors can act, then of course we should. That particularly drives a lot of our humanitarian work in crises. But pillar 2 is a focus on duty bearers, those organisations and individuals that have the obligation to ensure children's rights. Governments in particular, but also private companies, also other adults within a community. And finally, pillar 3 is about empowering people to be able to assert their rights and to be able to hold those duty bearers to account. And that basically is the kind of framework that we apply all around the world, whatever we're doing in health or education or child protection or in conflict and humanitarian crises, we apply those principles. What can we do for immediate relief? What can we do to get duty bearers to take their responsibility, and how can we empower children and their carers and their communities to be able to hold those duty bearers to account? So child rights, as I said, is kind of absolutely crucial. Next year is the 30th anniversary of the ratification of the Convention, of the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We're working with a range of other child-focused NGOs on a campaign, a new report, trying to put this back on the agenda, because there's definitely been a shift away from an understanding of a rights-based approach among the NGO sector, but among governments as well. And we know, if we look at the world at the moment, and you all have your opinions, but we're not in a great place for international solidarity and respect for rights. We're seeing the UN system getting undermined. We're seeing a lack of solidarity. We're seeing aid, which is one of the ways in which countries like the UK have an obligation to support children's rights. We can see aid starting to be used in lots of different ways that maybe aren't central to addressing children's rights. Aid is meant to be supporting the rights of children in low and middle income countries, and yet we're seeing it starting to be used for peacekeeping, starting to be used for refugees within Europe by some of the European donors. And basically, as I would argue, that we're entering a period where we really need to reassert the role of the UN, those international norms, those international agreements, because they are the framework that helps us to think about children's obligations to children, to protect children, to make sure children are able to survive, be healthy, and to develop. So that would be my case for the importance of child rights. I'll stop there, because what we're going to hear from Chris is about some very practical work that's going on from his organisation. Thank you.
Hi, it's really nice to be here tonight, and thanks for inviting me along. On an all-male panel, it seems a bit daft to talk about girls' work and work with girls. I can say that our girls' work is on the way to South Africa at the moment, which is why she's not here tonight giving a talk, so I'm in her place in that respect. What I want to talk about is girls living on the streets. And there's girls living on the streets of London, young women and girls living on the streets here, but around the world, and how they're viewed and why rights actually matter. Because if you see a 14-year-old who's on the streets, you may not think immediately this girl's rights are the key thing. You may well think this girl needs rescuing. You may alternatively think, how much will it cost me to sleep with her? You may alternatively call she's some filthy beggar, I don't want to have anything to do with her. You may have a whole load of stuff which goes through your heads. From our side, what we would say is that actually, unless you come in from a position which fundamentally starts with that girl's rights as a person of infinite worth, then actually, where do we start with this person? Unless we start with something which says our response have to be on her terms, as opposed to what we dictate those should be, then how do we move forward? Now, that's really easy said than done in lots of ways, but it's also the only effective work as well. So basically, for many places around the world, if a girl's on the streets, and most girls have come onto the streets because they've been sexually abused at home, some will have run away for fun as well, so that we make that absolutely clear. Many will come from very, very poor backgrounds, and for the majority will do, but there'll normally be some driver which has led them onto the streets. It may be family breakdown, but unfortunately abuse is one of the most common ways, maybe violence as well, and alcoholism plays a key role in parents' alcoholism in that. So once they come onto the streets, many of our partners will say that within 1 or 2 days, if they're not identified by an outreach worker that early, the chance of getting them off the streets are really, really small. Because they're seen as being very vulnerable, which they are. They're targeted by people. They're looking for some sort of security, and that's really lots of tempting ways of doing that in the start. A boyfriend who's older going to protect them. And then they get trapped into lifestyles. And they get trapped into a position they can't get out of. Trapped into addiction, trapped into a load of health issues as well, having their own children, a whole load of steps on the street, which means that it's incredibly difficult to leave. Not only that, for girls on the streets, every name which is called becomes a name which they're known by. So these girls are viewed as being prostitutes and tramps and dirt and a whole variety of other names. And therefore, for the girls themselves, that says a great deal about how they view themselves. They're seen as being responsible for being there in a way which boys aren't as well. So girls are there and they're responsible for being there in a very different way as well, and that's internalized. And then you've got the trauma they've experienced, which is internalized. And then, so when someone says, come to this shelter, here's a future, how are you going to trust that? How are you going to really believe that? How are you not going to push back at that all the way along? Because actually you've got nothing you really can believe in. So that's all part and parcel of what goes on there. So for us, On Her Terms, basically started from a few years ago, us being sick to death of going to projects, which we work with, are fantastic projects with people on the streets, and them saying, we don't know how to respond to girls. We really want to respond, but we just can't get it to work. Unless we get them straight away, we can't get this to work. And we work with 3 partner projects, and we just started rolling this out with other organizations to look at what is needed. And the first thing was that it's about relationship. It's about workers who just go out and build a relationship and will consistently build a relationship with these girls and see them as being incredibly valuable and seeing that their rights matter and who they are matters. And workers who will take an awful lot of crap, an awful lot of being let down consistently, and will be there for them. And in that building trust, it's then developing responses with the girls which make sense for the girls. So one of our partner projects, every Monday the girls come and do their washing, and they have a shower, and they also have some food to eat. It's not exactly rocket science. But if they opened the doors and said, come and do this, they wouldn't have come. But as they developed a relationship and they said, this is what we really want, they said, well, why don't you come and do this? And they sorted it all out. For another one, basically the key turning point for them was when they went to the funerals of 2 girls. Both the girls had died from TB and HIV-related illnesses, or AIDS as it was, related illnesses. And the other girls saw that the only people at the funeral were these 2, the workers from the project. And so it's about those hard yards. But it's also about workers themselves who are able to identify some of who they are and what it means for them to be doing this, what it means for them as women to be responding to these girls. Because very often they're judged as well. And they will often have people saying to them, why are you wasting your time with these girls? Why are you doing this? And so for us, our response has been to not only look to fund those work, but also to be working with the workers, if you like, to care for the carers. To be bringing those workers together to share their learning and to share how they can move forward, to share their stories so they can be better equipped to work with girls in the streets. Because where it must lead to is not only that girls are able to make their own choices and take control of their lives, but also that they can become involved in advocacy work themselves. And I can say on my process, but I want to talk a bit about the absolute importance of children being involved in those calls for rights, which Sana mentioned just now. Because for girls like this who are judged and are seen in these ways, we can run 100,000 campaigns. And we will nudge perceptions to an extent. But it's only really when we meet these people or we hear their stories, the failings, the successes, the stories of these people, and we engage with that as people, that actually we find our perception being challenged. And one of the key things to drive anything forward is changing public perception. If local stakeholders, businesses, etc., think actually to chase these girls off, to round them up, lock them up, which is very current, or if you go to Tanzania at the moment where pregnant girls are not allowed in school, if you go for any of those sorts of things, then you have to change perception. You have to have a legal framework as well. That's really important, but you have to start with a perception change. And you have to try to get it so that these girls are able, ultimately, to articulate and challenge something so people see them as humans and as of enormous worth and value, as opposed to labeling them, which too often happens. So a big chunk of it is that. So that's one hugely important strand, which on a grassroots level is really important. And whether that's through the use of sport, whether that's through the use of media, whether it's through any number of different things, it's finding ways to do that. Our particular project in South Africa, which done some work on that. Another project filmed one of the girls, put it in the local papers under the title Street Girls, didn't ask permission, her mother saw it. That whole group said, well, you can't take any pictures of us because these people did this to us. We're labeled as street girls. Our mothers saw that. We're not this. And so one thing like that took it back about 10 or 15 steps in that. And that's the sort of context to give it that grounded thing, whereby as we move to getting their voices heard, it's a really difficult long-term process which must be dealt with real dignity, and they must make the choices about it. That's one part of it. I said it had to go in a wider context. It has to go in a legal framework. So at the moment, last year there was, I never remember what it's called, so I'll just read this bit because I can never quite get it right. A UN general comment on the rights of children on the streets. So last year the UN passed a general comment. That's not legally enforcement, but it's guidelines for states. And involved in that were children themselves. There's a major participation exercise to shape how that went. And that's trying to give guidelines for states. Now, states don't need to adopt that, but it gives a framework for people to put pressure on externally as to what they should adopt. Then it also needs the middle to the large-sized NGOs who have an ability to speak to ministers and those people to be driving forward at that level. Because grassroots organizations cannot do that. So you need those, you need the child rights agencies in those countries speaking up on those issues. And you need that coalition at everything. You also need politicians who get it. If you go to so many countries, the portfolio for children is shared by, women, survivors of torture, disabled. They've got about 15 things which they kind of dump over there in the portfolio. So you've got to be working on all those levels. And it requires that amalgam of different responses in order to make change. But what's for sure, unless you can change perceptions of how children are seen, you're never going to make progress with girls on the streets and people like that. Because they're the ones who have so many things inflicted upon them. We can make individual progress, but we have to fundamentally change the way those children are seen. I'm going to stop there. I should just say before sitting down what Amos does, because I didn't mention that at all. We exist to basically, we're a small NGO, deliberately small so we can be creative and we can take risks. And that's part of what we want to do. And to do campaigns which are really hard to do, because something like this, the numbers are small, they're really small grassroots organizations, they're just difficult in that respect. So we do that. We exist to challenge injustice, to build hope, and to create change on the ground with local partner organizations. One thing I should mention as we're talking about child rights, we do extensive work in Palestine. And all of the problems with the UN and the problems with children's rights, we would most clearly see in Gaza, whereby the legal frameworks are ignored, and whereby we see the same situations which we've witnessed this summer, particularly with children in Gaza. And I'm very happy to pick up anything on that as questions. That's just to give a caveat. But if you want to find out more about On Her Terms, there's details around in various places. Please do pick it up. Have a look at it. I've just given a few bits from it. I could talk for a lot longer, but you get bored. So I'll sit down now. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Simon and Chris. We'll now be opening the floor to questions. You can, there's a microphone being passed around, and you can direct the questions to a particular speaker or to the panel in general. Thank you. So, any questions?
You mentioned that there were some difficulties in accepting, in some nations, accepting the principle of children's rights. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that and whether there are particular regimes or particular philosophies, either democratic or anti-democratic, or with a particular religious flavor that are particularly challenging, and that, in fact, people here could be helpful in shifting. I imagine that Christians have not always been at the forefront of this, but maybe rather more now, for example.
So I think you're absolutely right that I think that religious communities have been either way. They have been sometimes fantastic champions, and again, the history of fighting child labour within the UK, there's definitely been important religious figures that took stands against that. But there's also been religious voices which have been against a rights-based approach. You know, generally, perhaps it's support for the family, support for patriarchy in some circumstances, have argued against the rights of children. I think, you know, if we've got all the countries in the world have said they accept the Convention on the Rights of the Child, with the exception of the United States, then you've got lip service being paid to it on the whole. But what we see, and we're very kind of depressed by, is that you see a lot of governments sign up to international protocols without having any real meaning to do something about it. And I think that's the problem more than perhaps any of them rejecting the principle. It's when it actually comes to the reality of what it means. So on one level, if you're going to protect children from sexual abuse, from assault, you need a child protection system. And that child protection system comes into conflict with the family, you know, because it's within a lot of families that there may be abuse, maybe children are working, maybe sexual abuse can happen within the family. So you need to resource and empower a legal system to be able to challenge abuses of children's rights. If children have the right to survive, to be healthy, to be educated, then you need governments to take their responsibility to raise resources and spend resources on universal services. And what we see in far too many countries is that you still have an elite who are quite wealthy, a small elite in some of the low and middle income countries, but definitely there and definitely wealthy, not paying fair taxes, a lot of illicit financial flows, money moving out of the country, all of which means the government is not, and the government is probably listening to those people more than it's listening to the kind of children we've been talking about, that government not taking its responsibility to raise resources and provide and do its essential role. So I think around the world you can see it both ways in terms of religious communities. I think they can be fantastic champions, and there are lots of examples where they are, but they may also, in some circumstances, be hostile to the principle of children having individual rights outside of their family. And that's a very important one. You know, we see it here in the UK, and we see it around sex education in schools. You know, we see some religious families saying those children that they want to decide whether their child receives any sexual relationship education in schools, because the primacy of their beliefs take precedence for them over the rights of their child to have a full education and to be able to make choices. So I think it's both ways, and what we need to do, and we do, work with religious communities who are willing to take a stand.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with all of that. I think also we need to recognise the complexities of it for many people in different situations. As you were asking the question, I was thinking about a community of pavement dwellers we work with in India, and our partners work with there. The girls there will get married normally about the age of 14. So under the Indian constitution, they're not allowed to get married until the age of 18. And they'll get married there because normally, not always by any means, but most of the parents think it's a lot safer for the children to be married at the age of 14 because they live in the pavements, and so they're literally on the streets. And so therefore, as they're 14 plus, they're very, very vulnerable. And so actually within that, because for us normally if we think of child marriage, we blame the parents as well, and we enter into a whole cycle like that. Actually, when you start to engage a family and say, look, how can we make this so that your daughter can go to school? How can we engage in that way so that her rights to education are realized, and that what you most long for, that she is safe and she has a future away from the streets, is realized, then you have a different conversation. And I think I know for Save Children it's the case as well, that we do need the high-level policy, but it is so much of it is that situations like that, when we're just journeying alongside people, where you see lives transformed. And I would love to say that a particular religious group champions anything particularly good. We do some work in Central America on girls' rights there, and the church is particularly awful about that. There's no getting away from that. And so we see it with different groups. We'd also, and I speak as a person from the church, but we see it with different religious groups and a whole lot. So you see both sides coming through. And we see some wonderful champions from religious groups as well. So it is a really hard way to generalize on any of those things. In terms of specific countries, there are so many violations in different countries. At the moment, we're really concerned by the situation in Tanzania. We work in Tanzania about teenage girls not being allowed to go to school at all. And there's a lot more than just being not able to go to school, that it's illegal to be pregnant if you're a teenage girl. And that the government there is becoming intransigent about it. So the IMF have just stopped money going to, not the IMF, the World Bank, whichever one it is. I never can remember if the IMF is the one from Mission Impossible, or if it's the other one, whichever one it is. And so you see that situation there. So there's very clear things we can do in certain situations. But actually, we can get overwhelmed by the sheer number of situations. And so for us, I think what we would say is we have to drill it down to specific things which we can engage with for most people, not for everybody, because some people just love the big picture stuff and can really hold that.
Any other questions?
Could I ask Simon to say just a little bit more about the challenges being faced in the United Nations and elsewhere to approaches which we used to take for granted, that there would be, at least in theory, universal declarations and programs around human rights? And if this is the Trump question, which I guess it is, to locate it also in Israel-Palestine, because I think both of your organizations have involvement there. What is going to be the effect on children there by both less attention being paid to rights, but also about the withdrawal of money for refugee programs, in both cases by the United States?
So, I mean, the point I made earlier about international norms, I think we can see are under threat. You know, you may have your own opinions about Brexit, but we're moving into a world where that kind of sense of solidarity between countries is definitely decreasing. And we've seen the United States withdraw from a number of UN bodies, and I think we're going to see more and more threats like that. We've also seen a number of kind of the consensus that there was perhaps 10 years ago about UN bodies making good, clear judgments, holding other states to account, is really going to starting to dismantle. We're seeing a lot of the resolutions that are coming. We were involved in a resolution at the World Health Assembly about regulating the promotion of breast milk substitutes, which we know cause a lot of damage around the world by undermining breastfeeding and does lead in some cases to mortality. We found that the United States was acting very differently at this World Health Assembly than it had in the past, because it wanted to weaken the resolution, remove any criticism of the behavior of companies. When we look to the World Health Organization, which works by consensus and by member states building a consensus, we look to them to set some norms and hold states to account. And I think that's getting weaker and weaker. What we have to do, you know, it's from all directions, and I guess I've talked a lot more about the kind of UN level agreements. There is the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child that receives reports from governments against what they're doing to report on what they're doing on their obligations under the CRC, and issues responses where it identifies problems, as well as issuing the kind of general comment guidance that Chris talked about. I think probably I'll let Chris talk a bit more about Palestine for the work that you're doing there.
So we do extensive work in Palestine and advocacy work predominantly. Campaigning for full equal rights is basically what we believe is essential for everybody who calls Israel-Palestine home. What it means for children in Gaza is a really interesting question, because basically Israel, from its earliest formation, realized the UN didn't have any teeth at all. And it realized that actually it didn't need to adhere to any of the UN resolutions and declarations, because those which were passed about refugee rights of return and those things, actually there was no enforcement of it at all. And so what we've witnessed in Israel is a situation, and in Palestine, a situation where the UN has basically been used predominantly as a band-aid. And it's been used through UNRWA to fund programs for children very extensively. It's spoken up consistently, but it's not done anything more than that. It's not leveraging change. UNESCO awarding Palestine rights to be, and particularly the Church of the Nativity, to be a World Heritage Site, which is not exactly rocket science. The Church of Nativity would be a World Heritage Site. That led to Israel pulling out, and has ultimately led to the US pulling out as well. So what you see is this kind of the UN being devalued massively there. You see UNRWA being massively restricted in the funds going to it as well, which is going to cause huge problems not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but also in the neighboring, but also particularly in Lebanon and in the camps there and other places. We also witnessed the events this summer where, and the numbers are pretty horrendous of this, where in the Friday protest marches, over 22,000 people have been injured, over 11,000 I think it is now hospitalized, over 5,000 shot with live ammunition, and many, many, many of those are children. And there's nothing. That's it. There's nothing. And so within that, for us, we have to talk about these children's rights and to challenge the notion that if we talk about Palestinian rights, that does not deny Israelis' rights. That's just nonsensical. Calling for one person's rights doesn't mean someone else doesn't have rights. And if you think that way, and if we believe that's the case, then we've just got suckered into something which isn't real. And so for us, we've got to be more clear about calling for those rights. We've got to be more specific about what we call for rights of children, particularly in Palestine now, because it is looking hopeless. As our partners in the hospital there said to us this time, said, for young people and children in Gaza, life and death have the same value. And you could do the same in Yemen, I'm pretty sure, in Syria, in lots of places. I'm sure you could list about a dozen places where that would be the case. That's just awful. That's what we need to be engaging with. And we would love to see the UN become the body which it so nearly was, but is being undermined. How we respond when that is undermined is really hard for all of us. But somehow we have got to get to a place where it's not just protectionist policies which we're fermenting, but actually we're actually engaging with people in different situations. We would argue the best way of doing that is trying to get local connections with local connections and try as much as possible to do that, person-to-person exchanges. But it is really, really hard.
We had a question over here.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking tonight. We happen to all be international child studies students at King's College, so this is really relevant to everything we're studying right now. I have a question regarding the UN CRC with the upcoming 30th anniversary. Do you believe that it still holds the same weight and universality that it did in 1989 with 21st century children today?
I think we have to be a bit pessimistic about it, but we have to hold on to it because it is such an important convention. It's the most ratified UN convention that there is. You know, it's the one that established a consensus. And there is something about child rights that are less easy to argue with than other human rights treaties. And so the fact that it was adopted so enthusiastically around the world ought to give us a lot of hope. But 1989 was a very different era. I think the reason why we need to make a noise about it for the 30th anniversary is to remind governments of those obligations, to draw attention back to the rights of children, not just their needs. You know, we found, I think, in the 30 years since the CRC, in the international development world, a lot of kind of competing arguments have come to the fore. You know, there are lots of arguments about charity, basically. So, you know, when we talk about the needs of children in countries, and we talk about what we can do to help them, then we're very much putting a charitable frame onto that. And the reason why we've got to go back to talking about rights is because that charity frame is not adequate. It doesn't lead to the long-term, large-scale solutions which are in the hands of governments. There's also a frame of talking about global security. You know, do we want to act on some of the worst situations in the world because of the threat to instability or because of migration? You know, we hear arguments coming from Europe in particular and from the EU that addressing poverty and inequality in countries should be done for the reason of preventing migration coming to Europe, which is not a rights approach at all. That's the opposite of it. And we also find ourselves a lot of the time talking about economic development. We hear it from our current government, we hear it from the World Bank. The World Bank has just released a human capital index. So they've looked at the well-being of people in countries with a strong emphasis on health and education and nutrition, and they've ranked them according to what they call human capital. Now they're making the arguments that they believe may work with finance ministers that actually if you want your country to develop economically, then you need to make your population healthy, make sure children can be educated because they're the future workforce. And we use those arguments at times as well, of course, but actually getting back to understanding why rights are inalienable, why they are given and agreed, why they are a means to hold governments to account, why legal processes mean that governments should be doing what they can to secure those rights, can be used and should be used. You know, in the UK, we've achieved 0.7% of GDP as a contribution to international aid, and it's enshrined in law. But it's still talked about in terms of charity, return on investment, a good deal for Britain, building British influence. As we leave the EU, there's a whole narrative now about global Britain and how we play our part and how aid helps us to have influence in the world. Well, actually, you know, the fact that a wealthy country whose wealth was made on the basis of the poverty of many parts of the world, that having an obligation to put some of its wealth into trying to reduce poverty and inequality in developing countries is a rights-based approach, and one we need to keep our argument that way, even if we do borrow some of the other arguments. But the 30th anniversary and attention back on the CRC, very badly needed.
Yeah, I'd agree entirely. I think the report from the UN on austerity last week really highlights why we need the UN.
as you know, the CRC, the right holders in CRC are children. That's the only international convention on rights which has children as the right holders. And the duty bearers, so suppose if they are the right holders, that means they themselves cannot fight in a court of law or whatever, if their rights have been trampled on or not been given or been denied. So in this particular context, CRC very clearly might not openly say that, but it puts the focus on family, because from your lecture, I thought that families are responsible for some of the worst violation of children's rights, but it actually CRC puts family as the focus, and any child protection scheme would not work unless, in other words, the family is the focus in order to safeguard the children's rights. That's one of my comments. The question really, the question I want to ask is basically that, as you know, the manufacturing base in most of the Europe and UK, even in North America, is the manufacturing goods, most of them, especially say garments and things of that sort, where most of the child labor is being employed. And we still haven't made that as a mandatory, or mandatory in order to export the goods, even services, goods and services. So don't you think we in the UK and Europe and North America are also violating the children's rights by exporting those goods and articles? And by extension, basically, we are also as much responsible as those countries where the goods are manufactured and services are provided.
Yeah, I'll take a bit of that. And then the first thing I'd say is, if you ask any child where do they want to be, they'll say with their family. A child in the worst situation in the streets will say, I want to be home, I want to be with my family. Family is desperately, desperately important. But we all know that family is a difficult concept. It's a very fluid structure as well. And we have to be aware that family is not the unit family which we see. It has many different formats. And that means that, so for us, what we try to do with children is to reintegrate them back into homes, and whenever possible, the family. Now, Forward and our partners there, and they do extensive work, all of them, on working with families in order that they can understand their children, they can listen to their children, they can see why their children ran away, they can change behavior. I remember a little while ago playing pick-up sticks with his father and daughter as part of a reintegration process, whereby it was to try to get them to communicate. And for the first time they'd ever played together. They just never played together, it just never happened, it wasn't part of the culture. And so in every respect, family is desperately, desperately important. But also, it's really important when we see that the child has rights as well. When we just see them adopted within the family, it means that people then blame the child normally if there's a problem there, or don't listen to the child. So we have to see child rights as being central within the family, as are the rights of each of the other people within the family. Otherwise, we have no way of challenging those things, and we don't see the families which we'd like to see. Now, I completely agree that we're complicit about abusing children's rights whenever we allow goods into the UK which are manufactured by children. Of course we are. We abuse children's rights in lots of different ways as well. We neglect certain things in that. Very much so, and that complicity should be something which we challenge. I know you've done some work on that as well, haven't you? Yeah. So I'll pass over to you at this point. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, these are really useful points. You're right. Children hold the rights. On the whole, we would hope that families are the duty bearers, and they have a responsibility as well to protect the child and ensure the child's development, the child's safety, the child's protection. And in most cases, of course, that's what families are there for. They're dealing with a very difficult situation in many low and middle income countries where the extreme inequality, the lack of public services, the lack of any kind of social protection measures that basically provide the kind of child benefit that we have here in the UK, when there is not that to help poor families deliver just the absolute basic essentials for their children, then families are doing what they can. But children do have rights separate to their families. And in some legislations, there are children that have been able to bring cases, sometimes even against their own families. There have been cases like that. So it is important that the family is not assumed to be protecting the rights of children. Children do need a state that is there supporting the family, helping the family to ensure those children's rights, but sometimes in the cases where the family is the violator of children's rights, to act. And I think we need all of those things in place. In terms of our complicity, you're absolutely right, and we could take it into other areas as well. It is British arms that are being sold to Saudi Arabia that are bombing civilian populations in Yemen, and children are living in those areas and children are dying because of the actions that we as a country are taking to protect our arms industry. And we need to call those out wherever we can. Now, clothing manufacturers repeatedly commit to make sure there are no children within their supply chains. There are regular inspections, but we know from the evidence that we go and look at in countries that that isn't always obvious, that people know when an inspector's coming, the children are sent away for that period, and then they're back doing, again, still cheap labor in garment factories in countries like Bangladesh in particular. So yes, I think you're right. I don't know a lot about the kind of legislation that we could be applying to that, but it's certainly something we should be trying to make sure that it is an offence for the companies here to be selling products where child labour has been involved, and that would really help if those companies felt held to account here and liable for why they're allowing child labour within their supply chain.
We have a question over here, and then the last one will have to be from here. But we will be offering drinks after the questions, so you'll have more opportunity to talk then. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been great. As Katrina said, we've been studying a lot of this in theory, and so it's interesting to hear how it plays out. I'm curious, because so much of the history of how children have been served has been a very welfare-based approach. How do you move in your day-to-day work in keeping a rights lens at the forefront in the work that you do, so both at the advocacy level and at the direct practice level? Because I think given that we are adults and they are children and we are no longer children, I think it kind of, at least having a welfare and protection background for children, I think it's very easy to default to that. So how do you keep that at your forefront?
Yeah, I think it's a value-based, to be perfectly honest. I think if you value the opinion of children, if you think that's central to what you do, if you think that that they have choices over the provision they go to, if you're running a service and there's, we say voluntarism, whereby children can choose if they're going to be there or not, then those things are values which underpin something and which means you're likely to listen to children. So I think it comes into those values very strongly. I also get very concerned because there's also just a bit about relaxing into it as well, which is important. Because actually, very often the things which are good are good. You know, there's that bit which, when things which are good, they normally have participation. And when participation happens, you can relax into it. When you go and visit projects, which we do often, it's really obvious which ones don't have participation and which ones do. You see it in kind of minutes. And you just see it from how people are, to be honest.
I think we have to keep reminding ourselves a lot about it, and I think we're using the 30th anniversary of the CRC to make sure that child rights are still the bedrock of what we do in Save the Children, because it is so easy to get pulled into other frames. You know, if we're arguing with the World Bank about children, about the policies that they are encouraging in governments, low public spending, low taxation, you know, we need to argue with them. They often aren't reacting to a rights argument at all, so we use the economic development argument. We raise funds from the British public. Sometimes the way that we raise funds shows us as actors providing welfare for those children in developing countries. And it often doesn't forefront those children as actors in their own future, around their rights, around what their communities are doing to try and protect those children and protect those children's rights. And it's a real failure. When we try and find the right kind of progressive messages, it doesn't raise as much money as showing, here's a child that was dying, we helped save this child. And so we have to constantly challenge ourselves to make sure that the frame we're using is the right one. And I think by thinking about a problem, thinking what does the CRC do, and for us this model child rights programming that's been around for about 15 years, child rights programming to say, what do we do under Pillar 1? Well, that's where we do help and provide some kind of relief or whatever we can do. But whose duty is it to do this, and why are they not doing it? And how do we empower people to know what they're entitled to and to be able to hold governments to account?
And then the last question here, please. If we keep them brief, then we maybe have time for a few more.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting public debate this evening. I'm sure that we're all here because we're passionate about child rights. I come from a background of a legal and education sector background, which is, you know, where my passion comes from. And I guess my question is, what can we do to become more involved and engaged and to make a difference in the areas that you've been talking about this evening?
You want to take all the
sorry,
contributions?
there's a third. We'll take
all
the
three,
other
take
two
three.
questions, that one, and then we'll answer them.
Sorry, I've forgotten your name. You work for Amos, is that right?
Yeah, Chris, yeah.
Chris?
Yeah.
Maybe more direction, the question to yourself. Is there, or should there be, a difference between the rights of a girl versus a boy when it comes to children? And I'm thinking specifically about reproduction.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good question. Yeah.
The last question.
Sorry, I was not able to present when you were presenting. So, but from the discussion we had, so my question will be maybe superficial, and forgive me if I am not in the right track. But I'll be talking a little bit different perspective, what you are talking about. We are talking about the child right, child protection, other thing, and it's absolutely necessary. Family is important, and you talked about all this violation, that's fine as well. But it's the last 50 years, if you go a bit far, it's only in India, if you know about, it's under 18, number of under 18 children. It's whole of English-speaking countries, population is less than that. But all this child rights perspective, child rights issues, CRC, so whether the consultation and the imposing the idea of child rights, they're doing wrapped up promise, they're accepting that, whether that have been consulted accordingly or not. So that is one issue we'll be talking about.
Sorry, could you, we're not hearing you very well, could you just maybe say it very loudly, clearly, the question?
So this is the thing, this is the number of children, that's only the under 18, number of under 18 children in India alone is more than whole English-speaking country whole population. But all these policies, being an academic and as a practitioner, because as I travel all over the world, especially in African countries and Asian countries, we are imposing our ideas and rules and regulations, CRC need to be implemented. But at the same time, we forget that the needs are very different. Like in Africa, growing up one children needs a whole village, whereas in UK, that is totally different perspective. So implement that CRC or the child protection. We are going there from English-speaking country, those who are first language English, they think that, oh, we know better than you do child rights. So, and this is the prescription after 15 days of consultancy, and say, oh, this is the prescription you need to follow, and you will get everything done. So my question will be with you, because as I said, I didn't hear your presentation. So what you will be doing from your standpoint, just share, to think about that perspective as well, how we can minimize this Western colonialization in that way, how we can mitigate this, and how we can go to the field and really we can do something else. Today I was reading, only 3 countries in the world covers 57% of the whole refugee: Sudan, Afghanistan, and Syria. What we are doing about it, whether we should do things about children incorporate with all this aspect.
I'll go first for these ones. I think we have to choose what we want to get involved in and what we're passionate about. And so if we're passionate about a legal challenge and working with lawyers on something, then go for that. If we're passionate about actually a local response, for whatever reason, go for that. For us, we believe it's really important to lower the gap between, so we take a lot of people to visit and we bring people here. Because we believe that reducing that gap enables people to really engage and to see people in a very different way and to be partners. Literally, we recognize the wealth which we have, but the real partnership there. But I'd say just find the one thing to get involved in. And I would always say, act locally, think globally as well. Because certainly with Palestine, we can meet loads of people who are really passionate about Palestinian rights and Israel and all that stuff.